Hi, this is Ruth Brunner. I am here at Lakeview Cemetery in Windsor, Colorado. And I have Catherine Mercer from the Windsor Arts and Heritage Cultural Center, and she's going to give us a tour of some of the cemetery historic people from our town of Windsor, Colorado.
Yes, I am. Awesome. So as Ruth mentioned, my name is Catherine Mercer. I am the Museum Education Coordinator for the Town of Windsor Museums, and we are here today in historic Lakeview Cemetery here in Windsor to talk about over 150 years of Windsor history and that history that lives here today at the cemetery. Now, to get us started off thinking about a question, I want to ask you, whoever is out there watching, have you ever had to make a hard decision in your life? And that answer is probably going to be yes, we've all had to make difficult decisions. And today we're going to learn about 4 different families who came here to Windsor making difficult decisions that helped form the Windsor community as we know it today. And we are actually standing here in front of one of the very first families to ever move to Windsor. Here we have the final resting place of Julius Weller. And next to him we have his wife, Margaretha Weller. In case you couldn't tell that she's his wife, it says wife right here on the headstone. So just first off, looking at these headstones, you might notice a major difference between the two of them. And what's interesting about this is that we can read headstones almost like we can read books. They contain facts about the past and clues about the people who are buried here. So maybe you notice that Julius's headstone is significantly larger than Margaretha's. And we don't know the exact reason for this, but we have a couple of guesses. And one of our main guesses is that the family, the Weller family, gained more money between when Margaretha passed away in 1885 and when Julius here passed away in 1888. So we'll delve into their story a little bit to learn why exactly that was. But before we do that, I wanted to point out here, remember I said that headstones contain clues about the people who are buried under them. This one has an interesting carving on it. So here we have Julius Weller's information, but we also have this image here which shows a basket of wheat with a calla lily at the top. So when Julius Weller died in 1888, this was smack dab in the middle of the Victorian period. And the Victorians had their own language of plants and flowers. They believed that every plant and flower meant something. And here with Julius, with the wheat was a Victorian symbol of a long, good life, of longevity, sometimes even of old age, of having lived a fruitful life. So he was wanting to communicate that with his headstone. And then the calla lily was a symbol of marriage and fidelity and being faithful and loving to your wife. So Julius wanted everyone to know that he had had a long and fruitful life and a beautiful marriage to his wife, Margaretha. Now, if you notice here, on the front of his headstone, I'm not sure if you can make it out, but it says Edward Julius Weller died August 21st, 1888, aged 53 years and 5 months. So it's interesting that Julius was pointing out he'd had a long and fruitful life, but he was only 53 years of age, which gives you a clue into life in the 1880s here in Windsor when the Wellers were living here. And to set the stage just a little bit for the Wellers' life here in Windsor, maybe on the TV screen or whatever you're watching on at home, you can hear this traffic noise going by. If we were going to go back in time to the 1880s, there would be no traffic noise. You would not hear cars, but what you would hear might be the rumble of stagecoaches, because Main Street, where it runs through downtown, actually follows the original path of something called the Overland Trail. And the Overland Trail was an offshoot of the Oregon Trail, which of course was a main thoroughfare from the east to the west for people looking to settle in the west and start a new life. In the 1860s, the Oregon Trail was considered a bit dangerous, and there was a cutoff and a little offshoot from the Oregon Trail put in called the Overland Trail, and that ran through Colorado between Greeley and LaPorte. And that's actually the reason why Windsor is here today. We are exactly halfway between Greeley and LaPorte, and that is where the Wellers' story begins here in Windsor, with something called the Halfway House. So the Halfway House was named the Halfway House because it was built by a man named J.L. Hilton. He was from Fort Collins, and he realized that there was a business opportunity to be had out here. During the long journey on the Overland Trail between Greeley and Fort Collins, imagine that you're in this wagon all day, there's no trees, it's extremely hot, you're exhausted. Starting around the middle of the day, you would want to break for lunch. You might want to give your horses some water. You would want to take a break. And Mr. Hilton realized that this was a business opportunity to be had. He came here to Windsor from Fort Collins, and he settled. He didn't actually purchase in any way, but he settled on a parcel of land which today is just north of the Windsor King Soopers. If you've ever been here to the Windsor King Soopers in town, you know that County Road 15 runs by it. If you go north on County Road 15 from Main Street in Windsor and you cross the number 2 ditch trail, on the left side of the road you will see a big red barn, and next to that big red barn is a little white house, and that little white house is Hilton's halfway house that he opened in 1873 to be a stagecoach stop along the Overland Trail. And I have a photo of that house for reference that I will hold up for you to see here. It still looks like this today because this is a recent photo. It's still standing today on the original site of the land that Hilton settled on. So he ran it as a stagecoach stop. He had a post office there for a while, and he also did horse races there. Hilton was known for his horse racing out on the halfway house property. But then he quickly realized that maybe he didn't want to run the inn anymore. Maybe he wanted to go back to being a lawyer, which is what he was before he came out here to Windsor, and he left his property. And because he had never actually purchased it, that gave the Wellers a chance to come in and homestead the land. So Julius Weller here was originally born in Germany. He came over from Germany with his family as a child, and they settled in Michigan, where Julius became a cabinet maker and woodworker. Then in 1864, shortly after marrying Margaretha, who was also a German immigrant, he enlisted in the Civil War. And he actually fought in the Civil War for about 4 to 5 months. And after he got out, he and Margaretha had a son in 1867 named Fred Weller, and Julius started thinking about what he was going to do with the rest of his life. And there was something pretty interesting going on in the 1860s and 70s, which was called the Homestead Act. Now this was passed in 1864, and it basically said that if you were a person that could come out here to Colorado and you could settle on 160 acres of land, and you could live there for 5 years, and you could make improvement on your land, then at the end of that time, the land would be yours. In 1872, U.S. Congress passed an amendment to the Homestead Act saying that if you had served time in the Civil War, you could take your time served off of the 5 years. So Julius started thinking, oh, this might be a pretty good deal for me. I only have to be there for 4.5 years, and then I'll get 160 acres of land. So he packed up his family, Margaretha and Fred and himself, and they came out here to Windsor. When they arrived in 1875, obviously we had the Overland Trail running where Main Street is now. We had the halfway house, and we had a sprinkling of other homesteads, but Windsor, as we know it today, did not exist yet. There was not a town called Windsor when the Wellers got out here. So they settled in the halfway house. They renamed it Wellers after themselves. Margaretha continued to run it as an inn, and life was pretty good for them for a while out there running their inn and also farming on the halfway homestead property. We know that in the 1880 census, Margaretha is listed as a housewife who's keeping house, and Julius is listed as an innkeeper and farmer who's running the property. By the 1885 census, their fortunes have changed a little bit, and that's because once the train started getting up here to northern Colorado, nobody wanted to take a stagecoach. You wanted to take the train. So Wellers must have gone out of business fairly quickly with no traffic or less traffic on the Overland Trail route, and they had to become full-time farmers. So we know that in the 1885 census, poor Margaretha, who's in her 50s by this point, is listed as farming full-time. So it must have been fairly difficult on her. We know that shortly after the census was taken in 1885, she did end up passing away. So it was harder to be a farmer than it was to run an inn. And when Margaretha was buried here in 1885, she was actually the second person to be buried here in this cemetery, which at that point was not a cemetery. It was a random cow pasture that a man named Lewis Kern owned. he decided, hey, we might need a cemetery here at some point, and ended up donating the land eventually through the church that he was associated with. But when Margaretha was buried here, it was a cow pasture. There was only one other person buried here, a man named Edgar Hayner, who died shortly before Margaretha. So she was all alone out here for a while until 1888. There were about a dozen people buried out here in the meantime. And in 1888, her husband Julius passed away and was buried here by their son Fred. Now, I had mentioned at the beginning a little discrepancy in the size of their headstones. Oh, and I did want to show you as well a photograph of Julius Weller here that we discovered in his barn on the old halfway homestead property. So I'll hold this up for you to see. Alright, so what happened between 1885 and 1888 is around 1885, 1886, their son Fred decided to help open one of the very first stores here in Windsor, which eventually became the Windsor Mercantile. So Fred got a lot more money. We believe that he had more money to bury his father and have a larger headstone than the family did when Margaretha passed away. So that might be one reason for the size discrepancy. We can't say for certain, but we can guess. And Fred went on to run the store here in Windsor and eventually ended up trading the halfway homestead land to another man that we will talk about in just a second. And eventually that land passed on down to a family called the Jacobys, and eventually the land was actually gifted to the town of Windsor. And we are actually in the process of turning the halfway homestead land into an agricultural education site. We'll have cooking classes, we'll have camps, fun things like that, so keep your eye out for that opening hopefully here in the next couple of years.